At 68, sitting in my financial advisor's office, I told him I was thinking about selling my house and moving to the Philippines. He set down his pen, looked at me over his glasses, and said, gently but with total confidence, "Peggy, I have to be honest with you. That's a young person's move. At your age, starting over somewhere completely unfamiliar carries risks I don't think you've fully considered." I remember nodding, thanking him for his honesty, and driving home that afternoon, turning his sentence over in my mind. A young person's move. I was 68 years old, widowed for 3 years, a retired pharmacist who had managed a full medication inventory system for 31 years without a single significant error. I found it curious and a little insulting that a man 10 years younger than me felt qualified to decide what kind of risk I was capable of managing. I moved anyway, 11 months later, and I want to tell you what happened in the 2 years since, because "too old to start over" turned out to be one of those phrases people say with great confidence and very little actual evidence behind it. I need to establish something about myself before this story makes full sense. I have never been someone who accepted a limitation simply because it was stated confidently by someone else. I grew up the daughter of a factory worker in a small industrial town, put myself through pharmacy school in the early 1970s, when there were, in my graduating class of 41, exactly 3 women. I was told then, too, by more than one professor, that I was pursuing an unusually demanding path for someone of my background. I finished top of that class anyway, spent 31 years managing the pharmacy at a regional hospital, and retired at 62, with more professional respect than most of the men who doubted me at 22 ever managed to earn themselves. My husband, Walter, passed 3 years before that meeting with my financial advisor, a slow decline from Parkinson's that I managed largely alone in our final 2 years together, drawing on decades of clinical knowledge to advocate for his care in ways I watched other families struggle to manage without that background. After he passed, I spent a full year simply existing in the aftermath, the way you do, before I started asking myself a genuinely uncomfortable question. What, exactly, was I supposed to do with the next 15 or 20 years of a life I hadn't expected to still be living alone? I want to be clear that I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic sense during that year. I had good friends, a comfortable house, 2 grown children who called regularly, but I had also spent 31 years being extremely competent at something specific and demanding, and retirement, followed by widowhood, had left me with an unsettling amount of unused capability and no clear outlet for it. I remember, specifically, a Tuesday afternoon about 10 months after Walter's funeral, standing in my kitchen having just finished organizing a spice cabinet that hadn't needed organizing, and realizing I'd spent the better part of 3 hours on a task that used to take me 15 minutes, simply because I had no particular reason to finish quickly. I sat down afterward and cried, not from grief exactly, but from a kind of quiet horror at how much of my remaining capability I seemed to be spending on tasks that didn't require it. I had managed medication safety for an entire hospital system. I was now optimizing the arrangement of dried oregano. The idea didn't arrive as a grand epiphany. It arrived, almost embarrassingly, through my next-door neighbor's daughter, a woman in her 40s who'd spent 2 years working as a traveling nurse in various countries and had, over a fence-line conversation about tomato plants, mentioned in passing that she'd recently visited a friend retired in the Philippines and been struck by how many older Americans were building genuinely vibrant lives there. I asked more questions than I expected to, standing there with garden shears in hand, and she offered to send me some information. I told her, mostly to be polite, that I'd take a look. I looked at it that same evening, then didn't stop looking for the following 3 weeks, building the same kind of methodical research file I'd once built for complex medication protocols, cost of living data, visa requirements, healthcare access, climate, community reports from other retirees.
What struck me most, working through that research, was a specific realization. Nearly every objection I imagined someone raising had already been addressed by someone else who'd actually made the move. Healthcare concerns, addressed. with specific hospital names and quality comparisons.
Safety concerns addressed, with neighborhood-specific breakdowns. Loneliness concerns addressed, repeatedly, by accounts of expat and local communities that sounded, frankly, more socially rich than my own life had become in the 3 years since Walter passed. By the time I sat down across from my financial advisor to discuss the numbers, I wasn't asking his permission. I was informing him of a decision and asking for his help executing it well. I think that distinction is part of what he misread in that meeting. He assumed I was asking whether to do this, when I was actually only asking how. I want to mention one more piece of that research process, because I think it matters for anyone attempting something similar. I didn't just research the positive accounts. I specifically sought out people who'd tried this move and returned home disappointed, reading their accounts as carefully as the success stories, looking for patterns in what had actually gone wrong for them. Most of the failures I noticed traced back to insufficient preparation, arriving without healthcare research completed, without a housing plan beyond a single online listing, without any effort to build community before the isolation set in. I built my own plan, specifically to avoid every failure pattern I could identify in theirs. The same way I'd once reviewed medication errors at the hospital, not to assign blame, but to build better systems that prevented the next one. My children's reaction was harder than my advisor's, because it came wrapped in genuine love rather than professional caution, which makes it more difficult to simply set aside. My son, an engineer in his early 40s, was measured but clearly skeptical, asking detailed logistical questions that I suspect were really a polite version of, "Are you sure you can handle this?" My daughter was more direct. She called me the week after I mentioned the idea and said, with real worry in her voice, "Mum, I just don't understand why you'd uproot your entire life at your age, alone, in a place you've never even visited. What if something happens to you and none of us are there?"
I understood the fear underneath that question, because it wasn't really about logistics. It was about a specific, unspoken image she carried. Her mother, aging, vulnerable, far from help, something going wrong in a way that couldn't be quickly fixed by family nearby. I didn't dismiss that fear, because I think it deserved a real answer, rather than simple reassurance.
I told her the truth, that something could go wrong here too, in the town I'd lived in for 40 years, and that the difference between safe at home and risky abroad was, in my professional experience, managing patient care for 3 decades, far less about geography and far more about preparation, healthcare access, and community. I told her I'd spent 3 weeks building exactly the kind of preparation that addressed her specific fear, and I asked her to actually look at what I'd researched before deciding my plan was reckless. She agreed, reluctantly, to look. It took her 2 more months to come around, but she did. I approached planning this move the way I'd once approached implementing a new medication safety protocol at the hospital, methodically, with contingencies built in for the objections I anticipated, and enough research that I could answer nearly any question before it was fully asked.
I spent 4 months on logistics alone. I researched 3 separate cities before choosing one with an established international hospital, a genuine expat community, and a climate suited to a minor respiratory condition I'd need to manage.
I arranged a short exploratory visit before committing to anything permanent. 2 weeks, on the ground, meeting other retirees, touring apartments, testing whether the reality matched the research. I want to mention this specifically because I think it's the single most useful piece of advice I can offer anyone considering a similar move. Do not commit to a permanent decision before testing the actual experience in person, however thorough your research feels on paper. I also spent a significant portion of those 4 months on something I don't think gets discussed enough in these stories: the financial mechanics of actually executing a move like this responsibly. I met with 2 separate advisors, requested detailed comparisons of currency exchange strategies, researched exactly how my pension and social security would need to be structured to transfer reliably each month, and built a 12-month cash reserve specifically to cover the adjustment period before I fully trusted the new financial rhythm. I treated the money with the same rigor I'd once applied to a hospital budget, because I understood that financial anxiety, left unaddressed, would undermine every other part of the transition, regardless of how well I'd planned the healthcare or community pieces. That exploratory visit confirmed most of what I'd researched and corrected a few assumptions I'd gotten wrong. The neighborhood I'd initially targeted turned out to be noisier than online reviews suggested, and I adjusted my apartment search accordingly during that same trip, rather than discovering the mismatch only after a full move.
By the time I actually relocated permanently, 11 months after that conversation with my advisor, I had a healthcare plan, a community connection already established through 2 women I'd met during the exploratory visit, and a financial plan that had been stress-tested by a second advisor I'd specifically sought out because he'd worked with other American retirees abroad before.
I moved at 69, alone, having sold the house Walter and I had lived in for 32 years, having donated or distributed most of what filled it, keeping only what fit into a reasonably sized shipping container and 2 suitcases.
I won't pretend that process was purely practical. Walking through that empty house on my final day, the house where I'd raised 2 children and nursed my husband through his final years, carried a specific grief that no amount of careful planning fully prepared me for.
I sat on the empty living room floor for a while, in a spot where our couch had been for 3 decades, and allowed myself to simply feel the size of what I was leaving behind, before locking the door for the final time. The actual flight and arrival went almost exactly as the planning had predicted, which I credit less to luck and more to the thoroughness of that 4-month preparation period. My apartment, already secured during the exploratory visit, was ready. The 2 women I'd met previously picked me up from the airport, insisted on helping me unpack over the following 2 days, and introduced me, within my first week, to a broader circle of women roughly my age, mostly retired professionals like myself, who met weekly for what they called, with genuine affection, the smart women's lunch. I want to mention one detail from that first week that stayed with me. One of the 2 women, a retired judge named Carol, sat with me on my second evening and asked me to walk her through my entire research file, the same document I'd built over those 4 months. She read it carefully, made 2 suggestions I hadn't considered, and then told me something I've held on to since. Peggy, most people who move here arrive with a fraction of this preparation. You're going to be fine. And honestly, some of us could learn a thing or 2 from how thoroughly you did this. Coming from a woman who'd spent decades assessing the quality of other people's preparation for a living, that comment mattered more than I expected it to. I want to talk about what actually surprised me, because I think the surprises tell you more about a place than the things you correctly predicted. I expected the cost of living difference. I expected the climate adjustment. What I didn't fully expect was how quickly my professional background became relevant again. In a way, it hadn't been in the 3 years since retirement. Within 2 months, a local community health initiative, run partly by expat retirees with medical and nursing backgrounds, asked if I'd be willing to help review their medication management protocols for a small clinic serving an underserved neighborhood nearby. I hadn't looked at a clinical protocol in over 3 years. I said yes before I'd fully thought through what I was agreeing to. That volunteer work became, within 6 months, one of the central structures of my week. 2 mornings reviewing protocols and training volunteer staff, applying 31 years of expertise that had simply been sitting unused since retirement. I found out, doing that work, that too old to start over had never really been about my actual capability. It had been about whether anyone around me, including myself at times, could imagine a version of starting over that used what I already knew instead of assuming everything had to be relearned from scratch. I want to spend some real time on the weekly lunch group, because I think it explains more about what actually changed than any single dramatic story could. 6 women, ranging from 61 to 79, all retired professionals, a former judge, 2 former teachers, a retired architect, a former corporate attorney, and myself. We meet every Wednesday at a small restaurant near the market, and the conversation ranges from genuinely substantive one member's ongoing legal consulting work, another's advocacy for a local literacy program, to completely ordinary, the way any long friendship eventually becomes a mix of both. What struck me most, in the early months, was how different the tone of that lunch felt from conversations I'd had with peers back home in the years after Walter passed. There, conversations among women my age had increasingly circled around health complaints, grandchildren, and a kind of resigned commentary about how life slows down at this stage. Here, the default assumption in that Wednesday lunch group was the opposite, that our 7th and 8th decades was simply another chapter requiring the same competence and curiosity we'd always brought to every previous one. The retired judge, 74, started a small legal aid consultation service 8 months after I met her. The former architect, 71, is currently designing an addition to the local clinic where I volunteer, entirely pro bono, because she said retirement without using her actual skills felt like an insult to 4 decades of training. I don't think that attitude is unique to the Philippines specifically. I think it's simply easier to sustain in a community actively built by people who refused the same assumption my financial advisor made about me. I asked Carol once, over lunch, why she thought this particular group had formed so naturally. 6 accomplished women finding each other within a single expat community. She said something I think about often. Peggy, most of us didn't come here to retire from being competent. We came here because somewhere back home, people started treating our competence like it had an expiration date attached to our birth certificate. We found each other because we were all looking for a place that didn't assume that. I didn't have a better way to put it myself, so I've simply borrowed her explanation ever since. 14 months in, I had a genuine health scare that tested every assumption my daughter had voiced in that early phone call. A fall that resulted in a hip fracture, requiring surgery and a real recovery period. Exactly the kind of situation everyone had worried about when I first announced this move. I want to describe the actual experience clearly, because I think specificity matters more than vague reassurance here. The international hospital I'd researched carefully during my planning phase provided surgical care that a specialist colleague back home, whom I consulted afterward for a second opinion on my recovery plan, described as fully comparable to what I would have received at my former hospital. The cost, even accounting for my supplemental insurance, came to a fraction of what the same surgery would have cost me in the States. More importantly, the Smart Women's Lunch Group organized a rotating schedule within 18 hours of my surgery, without my asking, ensuring someone checked on me daily during the first 2 weeks of recovery, brought meals, and helped with the practical logistics of a hip recovery in a country where I was still building full independence. My daughter flew out during that recovery, arriving expecting, I think, to find her mother's decision definitively proven wrong. Instead, she found a coordinated support system that, by her own later admission, exceeded what she could have easily provided herself, given her own work and family obligations 4 states away. She told me, near the end of that visit, "Mom, I came here braced to help you pack up and come home. I'm leaving genuinely impressed by how thoroughly you built a safety net here. I don't think I gave you enough credit for how carefully you'd actually thought this through." That visit changed something in our relationship. Beyond just her opinion of the move itself, she started calling more often afterward, not out of worry, but out of genuine interest in the details of my life here. The clinic work, the lunch group, a small garden I'd started on my balcony that had somehow, against all odds, produced actual tomatoes, despite my previous total lack of gardening experience. I think watching me manage a real crisis competently, from a distance she'd feared would make competent management impossible, did more to change her underlying assumption about my capability than any amount of reassurance I could have offered before that fall ever happened. I want to return to that phrase from my financial advisor's office, because 2 years of actual evidence have given me a much clearer sense of what people usually mean when they say it. I don't think "too old to start over" is usually a statement about biological capability, though it gets phrased that way. I think it's usually a statement about the speaker's own limited imagination regarding what a person past a certain age is likely to attempt, combined with an understandable, if misplaced, instinct to protect someone from a risk the speaker hasn't fully researched themselves. My advisor wasn't malicious. He genuinely believed he was offering responsible caution, but his caution was built on assumptions he'd never actually tested. Assumptions about healthcare access abroad, about community availability, about what a 68-year-old former hospital pharmacist was actually equipped to plan and execute. When I brought him my finished 4-month research file, months later, to finalize the financial logistics, he admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he'd underestimated both the thoroughness of my planning and the actual infrastructure available to retirees making this kind of move. I think that admission mattered more to me than I initially expected it to. Not because I needed his validation to feel confident in my decision, I didn't by that point, but because it confirmed something I'd suspected all along. The phrase, "too old," usually says more about the person saying it than about the person it's being said to. I've thought since about how many other decisions in my life might have gone differently if I'd simply accepted confident-sounding caution instead of testing it against actual evidence. I thought about pharmacy school, about the professor who'd called it an unusually demanding path for someone of my background. I thought about the years I'd spent, without fully realizing it, quietly building a habit of research and evidence, specifically because so many people, across so many decades, had offered me confident limitations instead of curious questions. In a strange way, I think that advisor's comment was simply the latest version of a pattern I'd been successfully disproving my entire adult life. I'd just forgotten, for a little while after Walter died, that I still knew how. I'm 70 now, 2 years into this decision, fully recovered from the hip fracture, back to my full walking routine along the coastal path near my apartment most mornings. I've added a modest strength training routine twice a week as well, something my orthopedic surgeon here recommended specifically to protect against future fractures, and something I never would have prioritized during the busier decades of my working life. My volunteer work at the clinic has expanded. I now help train incoming volunteer staff on medication safety protocols, work that draws directly on 31 years of hospital experience I'd assumed, at 65, I'd simply set aside for good. The Smart Women's Lunch Group has become the closest friendship circle I've had since my early career decades. Women who understand both the specific competence I bring and the specific losses I've carried, without needing either explained at length. My daughter visits twice a year now, longer visits than she used to make when I lived 4 hours from her instead of an ocean away, because she says the trips here feel less like obligation and more like an actual vacation she looks forward to. My son still asks detailed logistical questions on our calls, which I've come to understand is simply his way of expressing care, rather than doubt, and I answer them patiently now instead of bristling the way I did in that first uncertain year. I also want to mention the volunteer clinic work has grown into something I genuinely didn't anticipate at the outset. What began as reviewing protocols 2 mornings a week has expanded into a small training curriculum I help develop for incoming volunteer staff, several of whom have gone on to formal healthcare training, partly because of encouragement I offered during those sessions. A young woman I trained in my first year, barely 23, is now pursuing a nursing degree, and she credits part of that decision to watching a 70-year-old former pharmacist take the work seriously enough to teach it properly rather than simply showing up to fill volunteer hours. I don't think I fully understood, at 68 sitting in that advisor's office, how much unused teaching capacity 31 years of clinical work had actually left me with. If you're sitting across from your own version of that financial advisor, hearing some careful, well-meaning version of, "That's not realistic at your age," I want to tell you what 2 years of actual evidence taught me. Their caution isn't necessarily wrong to consider, but it isn't automatically right either. It's usually built on assumptions they haven't personally tested, extended to you with real affection, but limited actual research behind it. The proper response isn't to dismiss the caution outright, but to out-research it. Build the file thorough enough that you can answer every specific concern with actual evidence, rather than simple confidence. And once you've built that file, don't ask permission. Inform the people who love you of your decision. Invite them to review your research if they're genuinely worried, and give them the same respect I eventually extended my daughter, the respect of taking her fear seriously enough to actually address it with evidence, rather than dismissing it as simple stubbornness on either side. It won't feel comfortable, informing rather than asking. Decades of politeness train most of us, women especially of my generation, to ask permission, even for decisions that are entirely our own to make. I felt that discomfort acutely, sitting across from my advisor, resisting the old instinct to soften my announcement into a question. I'd recommend sitting with that discomfort anyway, and making the announcement plainly. The people who truly love you will come around, as my daughter eventually did, once they see the evidence, rather than just hearing the confidence. I think about that meeting with my financial advisor often, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet amusement now. He wasn't wrong that this was a significant risk. He was wrong about my capacity to research, plan for, and manage that risk as thoroughly as I'd once managed clinical protocols affecting patients' actual lives. I sent him a card, actually, on the first anniversary of my move, a small, slightly mischievous gesture, a photo of myself at the volunteer clinic, with a short note thanking him for underestimating me thoroughly enough that I felt compelled to prove him wrong with this much documentation. He wrote back, graciously, admitting he now recommends a version of my research process to other clients considering similar moves. I don't know that I fully forgive the assumption behind his original caution, but I appreciate that he was willing to update his thinking once presented with actual evidence, which is more than I can say for everyone who offered an opinion on my decision that year.
I think the most useful thing I can offer anyone watching this, at whatever age they're considering their own version of starting over, is this. The skills that made you competent at whatever you spent your working life doing don't expire on your retirement date.
Mine didn't. I simply had to find a new place to apply them, and it turned out that place required crossing an ocean rather than staying comfortably where the doubt was loudest. I think about the spice cabinet sometimes, that Tuesday afternoon 10 months after Walter's funeral. 3 hours spent organizing something that didn't need organizing because I had no better use for a mind that had spent 31 years solving genuinely difficult problems. I don't organize spice cabinets anymore, not because I've stopped valuing an orderly kitchen, but because my capability finally has somewhere real to go again. A clinic training program, a Wednesday lunch table full of women who understand exactly what it means to have spent decades being good at something demanding. A life that uses, rather than merely occupies, the years I have left. If someone in your life has told you that you're too old to start something new, I hope this gave you something more useful than encouragement alone. Build the file, answer their fears with actual evidence, and then, respectfully, go start over anyway, the way I did, at an age plenty of people were certain was too late for it. I'll see you in the next one. And to anyone who's been told, by an advisor or a well-meaning relative, or their own quiet self-doubt, that some door has closed simply because of a birthday, I'd encourage you to check that door yourself before believing it's locked.